Jasmine Crockett, a black attorney, was asked to leave her first-class seat, even though she paid for it in full. The reason? She wasn't a familiar face in the VIP cabin. Within just 5 minutes, what seemed like a small act ignited a storm that would shake the entire airline industry. Jasmine didn't shout. She didn't resist. But she carried something far more powerful than outrage. Power. How did one quiet passenger force an entire system to confront the truth it had buried for decades? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the vaulted ceilings of Washington Dulles, Gate C-17 buzzed with quiet urgency. This wasn't just any flight. It was Skylux 801 to London, the route of diplomats, executives, and power brokers. Jasmine Crockett stepped aboard without fanfare. No entourage, no designer labels, just a sleek black blazer, slacks, low heels, and the kind of presence that filled a room even in silence. Her glasses caught the cabin lights as she moved toward seat 1A, premium workspace, extra legroom, perfect privacy. She carried a slim laptop, a leather folio labeled EU Ethics Draft, and the weight of billion-dollar decisions. No one gave her a second look. To them, she was just another quiet passenger. But Jasmine Crockett was no ordinary traveler. She was a renowned civil rights attorney and the CEO of Equinet, an AI ethics firm valued at $2.9 billion. She chose to blend in. The world, as she knew too well, didn't hand respect to women like her. But just as Jasmine powered on her laptop and opened her files, the atmosphere shifted. A tall blonde flight attendant appeared beside her row, posture impeccable, lips curled into a tight, polished smile, the kind that wasn't really a smile at all. "Excuse me, ma'am," she began, tone drenched in artificial sweetness. "I believe there's been a seating mistake." She gestured subtly toward the front, her voice lowering, but her condescension sharpening like a blade. "This seat, 1A, is typically reserved for our longtime elite guest, Mrs. Whitfield. She's one of our most loyal flyers. I'm sure you understand." Jasmine blinked slowly, trying to process the implication buried beneath the polite phrasing. The message was crystal clear. You may have the ticket, but you don't fit the profile. It wasn't about paperwork. It was about presence. And Jasmine, a black woman in a space rarely afforded to women like her, was being told, without the words ever needing to be spoken, that her presence itself was the error. Before Jasmine could respond, the air shifted again, this time colder. The click of designer heels announced the arrival of Karen Whitfield, a statuesque woman in her late 50s with ice blonde hair, draped in a snow-white trench coat and oversized pearl earrings that screamed old money. She didn't address Jasmine directly. Instead, she looked past her, toward the flight attendant, with a smile of entitlement so casual it bordered on cruelty. "I always sit there," she said, loud enough for at least 3 rows to hear. "This is my seat. Everyone knows that." Then finally she turned to Jasmine, eyes scanning her from head to toe like an unexpected stain on fine linen. "You must be new to this route," she added with a thin smile, voice silky with disdain. "You don't look like you fly this often, or belong up here at all." Every word hit like a slap dressed in velvet. The cabin held its breath. And for a moment, the fight wasn't over a seat. It was over place, power, and the right to exist without apology. The cabin was silent but charged, like the pause between thunder and lightning. Karen's words still lingered in the air, a venom-laced whisper dressed as casual entitlement. Jasmine didn't rush. She moved with the kind of deliberate control that only came from years of fighting to be heard in rooms designed to keep her silent. Without saying a word, she reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and drew out a Titan membership card. Metal, jet black, with beveled edges and the Skylux logo gleaming like a blade. It wasn't just a loyalty card, it was proof of elite status, earned by those in the top 0.1% of global flyers. Alongside it, she placed her first-class boarding pass on the tray table, edges perfectly aligned, like evidence submitted in court. The gold foil print caught the light. Seat 1A, Jasmine Crockett. Her voice when it came was calm but firm, precise like a closing argument. "This is my seat, booked in advance, paid at full fare, confirmed under my name. And this, she tapped the card gently, is my Titan membership. I've flown more miles with this airline than most people log in a lifetime. The flight attendant glanced down, her smile faltering as the reality of Jasmine's credentials crashed into her assumptions. But the hesitation in her eyes revealed a deeper truth. She was still looking for a way around it, as if the facts weren't enough, as if the system still had a say in who was allowed to belong. Jasmine knew that look. She had seen it in courtrooms, boardrooms, and now, at 38, with $1 billion company behind her, on a plane she helped finance through her business partnerships. She was done justifying her presence, and yet here she was again, forced to prove what should have been unquestionable. The cabin buzzed with a low, uneasy energy. Jasmine had made her position clear. Documents on the tray table, status undeniable, but clarity didn't always guarantee justice. The flight attendant stood frozen for a moment, eyes darting between Jasmine's Titan card and Karen's expectant stare. And then, with the subtlety of someone who'd done it before, Karen leaned in, lowering her sunglasses just enough to meet the attendant's eyes. Her lips barely moved. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice silk on steel, "for handling this delicate matter." She slid her hand into the side pocket of her cream-colored coat, then reached out, not toward Jasmine, but toward the pocket of the attendant's blazer. What passed between them wasn't a handshake, it was an exchange. A quick, seamless motion, a tight fold of bills, clean, deliberate, disappearing into navy polyester. It was over in seconds. No receipt, no acknowledgement. Just the silent transaction of privilege rewarding obedience. The attendant gave the faintest nod, eyes flicking to the money for only a fraction of a second, before smoothing her jacket like nothing had happened. Her smile returned, this time thinner, tighter, more mechanical. She turned slightly toward the front of the cabin, as if moving to check on something. But her pace slowed, a hesitation or perhaps guilt. But it didn't matter. The bribe had done its job, reaffirmed Karen's dominance, undermined Jasmine's truth, and tilted the balance in favor of injustice. What neither of them realized was that row 3, seat D, had a front row view. A young man, early 30s, traveling solo, had instinctively raised his phone minutes earlier when voices began to rise in first class. At first, he thought he was witnessing a simple seating dispute, but the tension, the tone, the carefully masked hostility, it pulled at something deeper. So he kept recording. And now through his lens, he captured it all. Karen's smooth sleight of hand, the whisper, the cash, the complicity. The lighting wasn't perfect, but the frame was steady, the audio shockingly clear. He didn't say a word, didn't shift in his seat. He just watched, documenting the exact moment when a bribe tried to bury the truth. He knew what this was. It wasn't just about a seat anymore. This was an orchestrated removal, bought and paid for. And thanks to him, it wouldn't stay hidden for long. But corruption never works alone. It always calls for backup. The flight attendant, her confidence visibly cracking after pocketing Karen's bribe, turned abruptly and vanished behind the first-class curtain. Less than a minute later, she reappeared with Trevor, the cabin's supervisor, walking beside her with practiced authority. Tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing the kind of self-assured smirk that came not from training, but from years of getting his way, Trevor carried himself like a man used to winning arguments without raising his voice. His eyes scanned the cabin, zeroing in on Jasmine with clinical detachment, as if she were a delay, not a human being. He stopped at her seat, squared his stance, and crossed his arms, every movement choreographed for dominance, not diplomacy. "Ma'am," he said, tone clipped and sharp, "I've been informed there's a seating issue here." He didn't ask what happened. He didn't request her side. He'd already decided who was out of place, and all that was left was getting her out. Jasmine looked up, her expression still composed, but something in her jaw tightened, a tiny shift that betrayed how familiar this was. She was no longer speaking to an airline crew. She was now facing a tribunal dressed in navy and gold. Trevor leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice just enough to signal control, but loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "We'd like to resolve this quickly and quietly. Would you mind cooperating and moving to another seat? It'll just be easier that way. Easier for who? The question stayed behind Jasmine's eyes, unspoken but thundering. Around her, the cabin had turned into a courtroom where no one waited for facts. They only looked for confirmation of their bias. A woman clutched her designer purse closer. A man in business class leaned sideways, pretending to adjust his tie while angling his phone toward the scene. Every breath Jasmine took felt heavier. She could feel the weight of judgment settling onto her, like turbulence without warning. Not one person stood up. Not one person said, "She's right." In that moment, it wasn't just the crew surrounding her. It was the silence of every person who'd rather avoid discomfort than confront injustice. The pressure was surgical, unrelenting, and intentionally public. Trevor stepped back slightly, glanced at the attendant, then looked to Karen, who stood just a few feet away, watching like a queen awaiting her throne. Her arms were folded, her face smug, her posture screamed satisfaction, because everything was going exactly how she'd planned. Jasmine was boxed in, not by metal walls, but by a system engineered to erode her dignity without ever raising a voice. She had the boarding pass, she had the highest tier membership, but none of it mattered. In this cabin, her qualifications had become invisible the moment she sat down. All that remained was the expectation: know your place and move. The tension in the cabin had shifted from subtle discomfort to something far more volatile, controlled but electric, like the final second before lightning strikes. Trevor stood over Jasmine with the practiced authority of someone used to obedience, his arms folded tightly across his chest, jaw clenched. Behind him, the flight attendant avoided Jasmine's gaze, her earlier confidence crumbling into rigid discomfort. Karen remained planted just feet away, arms crossed, her expression a portrait of smug entitlement, as if the mere passage of time without Jasmine moving was a personal offense. Passengers around them kept glancing, then quickly looking away, their silence loud, their complicity louder. This was no longer a dispute about a seat. This was a test of who the rules actually applied to and who they didn't. All eyes waited for Jasmine to fold, to rise, to retreat. Instead, she exhaled slowly, deliberately. Her every movement was calm but surgical, the kind of stillness that comes not from passivity, but from mastery of restraint. She placed her pen down beside her boarding pass, straightened her back, and looked up at Trevor with a gaze that didn't ask for understanding. It demanded recognition. Her voice, when it broke the thick air, was quiet but resonant, every syllable carried with the full weight of a woman who had fought too many battles to be cornered by this one. "I'm not moving," she said. "This seat is mine, booked under my name, assigned by your airline, paid at full fare." She paused, not to catch her breath, but to let the words settle like gavel strikes. Then just as steadily she added, "I am a licensed civil rights attorney. I know the law, and I know my rights." Trevor's posture faltered. For the first time he blinked, not out of fatigue, but confusion. This wasn't how these scenes usually played out. He was used to bluster or fear, to loud objections or quiet surrender. Not this. Not a woman sitting in perfect silence, perfectly within her rights, perfectly unwilling to be erased. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between orders and a reality that no longer fit the script. Karen let out an audible scoff, but it barely registered. Jasmine wasn't speaking to them anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong in spaces they'd earned. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't theirs to control. Jasmine owned it, held it, transformed it into a shield. Because sometimes the most powerful resistance isn't rage. Sometimes it's simply saying, "No, I will not move." Trevor's jaw clenched tighter as Jasmine remained unmoved, her spine straight, her voice calm, her presence unshaken. His tone shifted, no longer wrapped in the forced politeness of customer service, but sharpened by frustration and threatened authority. "Ma'am," he repeated louder now, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the cabin. "I'm instructing you for the last time. Either move voluntarily, or I'll be forced to call airport security to escort you off this flight." The volume of his voice wasn't meant for Jasmine. It was meant for the audience. It was a performance, and the message was clear. Look how difficult she's being. A woman refusing to yield was now being framed as a danger. Phones slowly tilted upward, fingers hovering over record buttons. No one moved to help her, but everyone was suddenly ready to watch. Jasmine didn't even blink. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't back down. She simply looked at him and replied with ice-edged precision, "Go ahead. I'll wait." The words had barely settled when the cockpit door opened with a mechanical click, and Captain Mason emerged. Tall, composed, a uniform pressed so perfectly it looked vacuum-sealed. His face was unreadable, carved from decades of authority, but his eyes betrayed something colder, an eagerness to resolve the situation swiftly, regardless of who was right. He strode down the aisle with the quiet command of someone used to being obeyed before he even spoke. Without addressing Jasmine directly, he turned to Trevor and asked, "Is this the passenger?" Trevor nodded once. The captain turned toward her, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression flat. "Ma'am," he began, his voice deep and deliberate, "I've been informed that you are refusing to comply with crew instructions. At this point, your actions are interfering with the boarding process and creating a disturbance for other passengers." Jasmine's eyebrows lifted, the first visible sign of incredulity. "I'm sitting in the seat your airline assigned me," she said, measured and unshaken. "There is no disturbance except the one being caused around me." The captain's eyes hardened. "Disruption doesn't require shouting, ma'am," he replied coldly. "It only requires refusal to follow lawful direction from airline personnel." The hypocrisy landed like a slap. She was being labeled a threat not because she had broken a rule, but because she had refused to break under pressure. It didn't matter that she was calm. It didn't matter that she had proof. It didn't even matter that she was right. She had said no, and in this system, that alone was enough to justify her removal. Behind the captain, Karen stood smirking, arms folded like a queen watching a servant being dragged away. The flight attendant's face was pale now, but she said nothing, not a word. The circle had closed. The stage was set. The truth no longer mattered, only control did. And Jasmine Crockett, for all her poise, her credentials, and her right to that seat, had just been officially marked as non-compliant. The call to remove her had been made, and with chilling precision, the system moved into place. Moments later, the unmistakable rhythm of boots echoed down the jet bridge. Two security officers in dark uniforms stepped into the cabin, eyes locked forward, postures rigid. The passengers parted instinctively, the way crowds do when authority enters a room, not out of respect, but submission. One officer paused at Jasmine's row, expression unreadable, voice flat. "Ma'am, we've been instructed to escort you off this aircraft." That was it. No mention of why. No acknowledgement of her boarding pass, Titan status, or the blatant injustice that had unfolded. Just a command, carried out without question. Jasmine didn't resist. She didn't argue. Instead, she slowly stood, her every movement precise, controlled, the grace of a woman refusing to let them steal more than they already had. She gathered her documents, closed her laptop, adjusted her blazer, and then, with her head held high, she stepped into the aisle. The walk down that narrow corridor was a gauntlet of quiet judgment. Passengers who had once ignored her now looked up, eyes wide with curiosity or contempt. Some filmed discreetly from behind menus or jackets. Others simply watched, smug in their silence. A man in a tailored suit muttered to no one in particular, "She should have just complied." Another leaned toward his wife and whispered, always looking for a reason to make a scene. Jasmine heard it all, but she didn't break stride. Each step was a statement. "You can take my seat. You will not take my self-respect." As she passed seat 1A, Karen was already reclined, a flute of champagne in hand, her satisfaction barely concealed. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Karen smirked. Jasmine didn't give her the dignity of a response. She walked past her with the elegance of someone whose value was never determined by proximity to privilege, but by the truth she carried in her bones. Once off the plane, the officers led her a few feet into the terminal and abruptly stopped. One glanced at the tablet in his hand, hesitated. "We were told to escort you," he said, suddenly less sure of himself. But there's nothing here that says you violated any policy. Jasmine didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth had never been the issue. The problem wasn't what she had done. It was who she was. As the officers awkwardly stepped away, leaving her standing alone near Gate 47, another sound broke through the chaos. Hurried footsteps. A woman mid-40s, red hair tied back, wearing jeans and a press badge on her backpack, approached with cautious urgency. "Ms. Crockett?" she asked, slightly breathless. Jasmine turned, instinctively guarded. "I was on that flight," the woman continued. "I'm a journalist. I saw everything. And I filmed it." She pulled out her phone and unlocked the screen, holding it out like a lifeline. "The bribe, the exchange, the crew's response. I caught it all. You need to have this." Jasmine took the phone slowly, watching the video as it played. Grainy footage, but crystal clear truth. The moment Karen slipped the folded bills into the attendant's pocket, the dismissive smirks, the words whispered with venom, her own refusal, calm and exact, followed by the arrival of security. It was all there. Not just injustice, but evidence. Not just bias, but proof. The journalist's voice softened. "You don't know me, but I couldn't sit there and let that happen. If you want to go public, I'll stand with you." For a moment, Jasmine said nothing. Then she looked up from the screen, met the woman's eyes and nodded. "Thank you," she said, voice steady, but carrying something deeper, resolve sharpened by pain. What happened on that flight wouldn't end with humiliation. It would ignite a reckoning. And now, with this footage in hand, the story was no longer in their control. It was hers. She stood still for a long moment in the center of the terminal, watching the crowd flow around her like a current. Behind her, the plane, the injustice, was gone. But it hadn't left her. Not the cold stares, not the smug silence, not the invisible weight that had tried, once again, to push her out of a space she had earned. Jasmine walked forward slowly, each step measured, controlled, past the boarding gates, past security, past the people whispering as they recognized her face. She didn't head for the exit. She turned toward the frosted glass doors marked Skylux First Class Lounge. Because power didn't retreat, it regrouped. Inside, the lounge was polished to perfection, gleaming marble floors, leather seating, the faint scent of citrus and expensive stillness. But the calm was cosmetic. Jasmine took a seat in the farthest corner, facing the runway through floor-to-ceiling glass. She placed her phone on the table and stared at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then, with a flick of her thumb, she called Elise Donovan, Chief Operating Officer of Equinet, and the one person who always knew what to do next. The line clicked. Jasmine didn't waste time. Her voice was low, razor-sharp, brimming with fire hidden beneath ice. "Elise," she said, each syllable like a drumbeat, "they just kicked me off a flight, publicly, first class, no rule broken, just a black woman in the wrong seat, apparently." A pause. "They picked the wrong person, prepare to move." There was silence on the other end for a heartbeat. Just one. Elise had been with Jasmine since the founding of Equinet. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't express outrage. She knew Jasmine's tone well. She only responded with 2 words. Understood. Mobilizing. Because this wasn't just personal, it was war, and Jasmine held the match. As the call ended, Jasmine opened her laptop. Notifications were already pouring in. The journalist's video had been sent to her personal inbox, encrypted and timestamped. A second file followed. Witness testimonies from 3 passengers who had seen the exchange, all offering to speak on record. She dragged the files into a secure server, hands steady, eyes burning with focus. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a corporate earthquake waiting to detonate, and Skylux Airlines was sitting directly on the fault line. What no one on that flight had realized, what the captain, the crew, and certainly not Karen Whitfield had understood, was that Equinet wasn't just a billion-dollar ethics tech firm. It was a silent force behind half the systems Skylux was planning to upgrade. For the past 8 months, Equinet had been in advanced negotiations to power Skylux's AI-driven customer support transformation, a $40 million contract that would overhaul the way the airline handled passenger experience, data security, and most ironically, bias mitigation. They were also the quiet financial muscle behind Skylux's most recent funding round, acquiring a full 30% of the airline's voting shares through a network of linked institutional investors, which meant Jasmine Crockett didn't just fly Skylux, she partially owned it. She took a breath and began typing directives to legal, media strategy, investor relations. Each message clinical, strategic, and pulsing with urgency. To legal, secure all footage. Prepare emergency injunction in case they attempt deletion or internal suppression. Initiate breach review. To PR, hold response until footage is verified. Prepare statement for controlled release. To board liaison, schedule emergency shareholder meeting. Non-negotiable. Every click of the keyboard echoed louder than the security officer's command. This was no longer just a legal matter, it was a corporate reckoning, and Jasmine wasn't seeking apologies. She was preparing consequences. Outside the lounge, the terminal continued as if nothing had happened. People boarded planes. Announcements echoed. But in that high-glass corner, something irreversible had already begun. Jasmine reviewed the footage again, this time not with pain, but with precision. The money-changing hands, the passive complicity, the systemic rot wrapped in politeness. And then her own voice, calm, firm. I know my rights. This wasn't about ego. It wasn't even just about her. It was about every quiet injustice that happened in business class, in hiring rooms, in board meetings where decisions were made before the first word was spoken. She had spent her career building technology to detect those systems. Now she would dismantle one live. Another alert came through. Elise had initiated internal mobilization. The company's crisis protocol, codename Hammerglass, was live. In 2 hours, Equinet would launch a controlled media leak to trusted outlets. In 3, their legal counsel would issue an open letter to Skylux's board demanding formal response. In 5, national news would run the footage. The countdown had begun. Jasmine reached into her bag and pulled out a pen, the same one she used to sign Equinet's first funding round 5 years ago. She tapped it twice against the side of her laptop, once for every time she had to prove she belonged. The third time would be different, because this time, the world would watch what happened when a system tried to erase a woman who built systems for a living. She leaned back in the chair, shoulders squared, jaw set. They thought they were ejecting a passenger. They had just woken a shareholder, a strategist, and a storm. And the skies above Skylux, they were about to turn black. While Jasmine orchestrated her next move from the quiet sanctum of the VIP lounge, the world outside was already catching fire. The video, just 2 minutes and 47 seconds long, had slipped from the hands of one journalist into the bloodstream of the internet like a digital wildfire. At first, it appeared on a small civil rights blog, then was picked up by a mid-tier media watchdog, but it only took one retweet from a prominent activist with 5 million followers for the fuse to fully ignite. Within an hour, the footage had exploded across platforms. Reddit threads dissected every frame, TikTok creators broke down the timeline second by second, and YouTube reaction videos began pouring in. The moment Karen handed off the money, the trembling smile of the flight attendant, Trevor's manufactured authority, Jasmine's quiet refusal, the security escort, the walk of shame they expected her to wear like defeat. It was all there, unfiltered, undeniable, and damning. And then came the hashtag, 3 words typed by a teenage law student in Detroit who captioned the clip, "She knew her rights. They knew their power." Justice for Jasmine. That phrase struck a nerve and roared across the digital landscape with ferocity. In just 4 hours, it had appeared in over 3.2 million tweets. Celebrities reposted it with captions like, "Unacceptable." Civil rights lawyers offered pro bono support without being asked. Airline passengers across the globe began sharing their own stories of quiet discrimination in first class, many of them eerily similar. Hashtag momentum turned into organized fury. Skylux's official accounts tried to stay silent, but silence was gasoline on the blaze. Within 6 hours, Justice for Jasmine was trending #1 worldwide on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. The injustice wasn't hidden in corporate silence anymore. It was being screamed across continents. News anchors broke into regular programming to run the footage. Primetime segments debated it. Podcasts began recording emergency episodes. Public figures, from tech CEOs to U.S. senators, issued statements of support. And yet, amid the media frenzy, the most devastating commentary didn't come from politicians or influencers. It came from the comments sections, where ordinary people wrote with razor precision, "I've seen this happen to my father. My mom was told she didn't look like she belonged in business class too. They didn't just pick the wrong person. They picked the wrong generation to try this with." The story had become more than Jasmine's. It had become everyone's story. And now the world wasn't just watching. It was waiting for a reckoning. While the world outside burned with outrage and the hashtag number Justice for Jasmine carved its place in digital history, inside the mirrored walls of Skylux headquarters in Manhattan, chaos was setting in. The comms team was first to ring the alarm, phones ringing nonstop, inboxes flooding with media inquiries, and posts multiplying across every social media platform like an avalanche they couldn't outrun. Internally, Slack threads ignited with frantic pings. "Have you seen this video? Who was the passenger? Did someone actually take a bribe on camera?" But by the time the commotion reached the executive floor, it was too late to contain. Screens in the boardroom now glowed with footage of a woman, calm, composed, being removed from her assigned seat by force while another passenger smirked, untouched, sipping champagne. The room was silent, except for the sound of their brand, once synonymous with exclusivity and elegance, becoming a symbol of elitist rot and racial bias in real time. CEO Richard Halston, usually unshakable in the face of earnings reports and merger talks, sat motionless at the head of the table, eyes locked on the paused frame of Jasmine Crockett being escorted down the aisle. His skin had turned ghostly pale, and his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as if he were chewing glass. "Someone tell me this isn't who I think it is," he finally muttered, though the answer was already clawing its way to the surface of his mind. A junior analyst, face pale, hands shaking, cleared his throat and slid a tablet across the table. On the screen, a shareholder profile pulled from the company's private investment network. Name: Jasmine D. Crockett. Occupation: CEO, Equinet Technologies. Equity stake via linked trusts and institutional funds. 30.1% voting control. A long pause followed, the kind that warps time. Then Halston whispered almost to himself, "Oh my God, she owns us." The silence that followed was deafening. One executive dropped her pen. Another leaned back so hard his chair creaked. No one moved, because this wasn't just a PR nightmare anymore. This was a strategic implosion. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a high-value customer. She wasn't even just a tech mogul. She was their largest single shareholder. And more than that, she was the visionary behind the very AI ethics platform Skylux had been preparing to integrate into its customer experience systems. A $40 million contract that now hung over their heads like a guillotine. The irony was grotesque. They had forcibly removed the architect of the very protections they claimed to be building. They hadn't just embarrassed her. They had publicly humiliated their most powerful stakeholder. A hand shot up. It was Janet Liu, head of corporate legal. Her voice was clipped, trembling slightly. "We have two immediate threats. First, if she initiates a shareholder revolt, we're vulnerable to losing board control. Second, if she withdraws from the tech contract, we'll fall behind in compliance modernization by at least 18 months. Our Q3 survival projections are tied to that rollout." Her voice cracked under the weight of what she wasn't saying. We are standing on the edge of collapse. Halston rose from his chair like a man trying to outrun his own shadow. "Get me her office. Now direct line. I don't care what time it is. I don't care who I have to beg." But before the assistant could move, another alert chimed from the monitor. The stock price was dropping, fast, double digits. Thousands of retail shareholders dumping shares. Institutional confidence evaporating by the second. Halston turned back to the board. "We need to control the narrative," he barked, but the desperation in his voice cracked through the bravado. "We issue a formal apology, full responsibility, Fire the crew if we have to, whatever it takes. But Janet cut in sharply. It won't be enough. She tapped her screen again and brought up the trending analytics. Justice for Jasmine had now reached 47 million impressions. 3 senators had tweeted. 5 CEOs from Fortune 100 companies had weighed in. Influencers, lawyers, celebrities, professors. The narrative isn't ours to control anymore, she said. It's hers. That sentence landed like a blade through the room. Because it was true. Skylux no longer owned its own reputation. Jasmine did. As tension mounted, another voice, calm, deliberate, came from the back. It was Robert Chase, an older board member with 2 decades of political and corporate crisis experience. Gentlemen, he said, slowly removing his glasses, this isn't damage control anymore. This is an extraction. We've offended the woman who designed the very tools that could audit our every bias, detect our every flaw, and broadcast it with precision. He turned toward Halston. You didn't eject a passenger, you ejected your future. No one dared to argue. Across the boardroom, phones buzzed in near synchrony. News alerts, investor emails, insider leaks. The collapse had begun, and it wasn't just financial. It was existential. Halston's voice dropped, hoarse and distant. We underestimated her. Janet shook her head. No, she said, you never even saw her. And that, more than anything, was the truth. Jasmine Crockett had walked onto their plane not with fanfare, not with a power suit or security detail, but with silence, intelligence, and receipts. She had been ignored, dismissed, disrespected, and now she held the future of the airline in the palm of her hand. No one in the room dared say it out loud, but they all felt it. Skylux had just made the most expensive mistake in aviation history, and Jasmine, she was just getting started. The boardroom was silent when the doors opened. Everyone stood, out of protocol, not respect, as Jasmine Crockett entered, flanked by her legal counsel, media strategist, and 2 high-level representatives from institutional funds that held significant Skylux shares. She didn't wear fury, she wore precision. Her black tailored suit was simple but sharp, a visual contrast to the chaos she'd walked into the day before. She carried no notes. She didn't need them. The truth had already spoken for her, across headlines, social feeds, and stock markets. Her presence alone shifted the temperature in the room. Executives straightened. Board members swallowed hard. Richard Halston, the CEO, forced a nod, but his face remained tight. Jasmine sat at the head of the table, the seat usually reserved for him. No one objected, because in this moment, everyone knew who truly held the power. She didn't start with pleasantries. She didn't start with introductions. She started with facts. Cold, hard, undeniable. You forcibly removed me from a seat I paid for. You allowed a bribe to influence operational decisions. You failed to intervene when racial bias unfolded in your cabin, on your time, in your uniform. And you did it to your largest shareholder and the architect of your next-generation ethics initiative. Her voice was calm, but each word cut deeper than the last. She paused, let the weight of that truth settle, then continued. I am not here to negotiate money. I am not here for an apology crafted by your legal department. She leaned forward, voice sharpening like steel drawn from a sheath. I'm here to make one thing clear. This company will change, or it will collapse. She laid out her demands like legal exhibits, one by one, deliberate and non-negotiable. First, she said, her eyes locked on Halston, the entire crew involved in the incident, including the flight attendant, cabin manager, and captain, will be terminated immediately with full public accountability. No murmurs, no protests, just shifting discomfort around the room. Second, this airline will undergo a 48-hour operational pause across all routes. Every employee, from executive to ground staff, will complete intensive training on bias, ethics, and customer dignity. Conducted by a third-party firm, monitored independently. No exceptions. A few board members exchanged alarmed glances. 2 days grounded would cost millions. Jasmine didn't blink. Cost is no longer your primary threat. Irrelevance is. Third, she said finally, her tone softening but not relenting. The $40 million contract with Equinet is suspended until internal audit systems prove your culture meets the standards you claim to uphold. Halston opened his mouth to speak, but she raised a hand. Don't. I know the numbers. I know what the loss of that contract means. I also know it's the only leverage I'll need to ensure this isn't just another PR stunt. There was a long silence. Then slowly she stood. Her final words were not a threat. They were a verdict. I could liquidate my position, dump 30% of your shares by morning, and let the market devour you. But I'm not here to destroy you. Not yet. I want something bigger. She looked around the room, locking eyes with each person who had remained silent as her dignity was stripped at 30,000 feet. I want transformation. I want this company to mean something more than status and uniforms. I want every single person who looks like me to never fear flying with you again. And then she said it. Quiet, clear, devastating. I could pull out, but what I want is real change. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone. This was no longer a shareholder meeting. It was a reckoning. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't asking for permission. She was rewriting the rules. The fallout began less than 24 hours after Jasmine Crockett left the boardroom. As promised, she didn't wait for change. She demanded it, and Skylux, cornered by public fury and shareholder pressure, had no choice but to act. The company scheduled an all-staff broadcast typically used for quarterly updates or holiday announcements. But this was different. The title of the internal live stream read only, Accountability Session, Mandatory Attendance. Thousands of employees logged in, pilots from Frankfurt, desk agents in Atlanta, engineers in Tokyo. The screen opened with a stark black background, white text glowing in the center. This is what failure looks like. Then without warning, the infamous flight footage began playing in full, unedited, uninterrupted, and damning. It started with the bribe. Karen's hand slipping folded bills into the flight attendant's pocket. Her voice a venom-laced whisper. Thanks for handling this delicately. Next came Trevor, stiff with fake authority, threatening removal. Then the captain, cold and indifferent, declaring Jasmine a disruption. Finally, the silent walk of humiliation as security escorted her off the plane, with Karen sipping champagne behind her. Employees across continents watched, horrified, as the truth played out not in lawsuits or headlines, but in real time, on their own company's feed. When the video ended, the screen faded to black again. Then three names appeared. Trevor Winslow, cabin manager Jessica Mayers, senior flight attendant Captain Dennis Reynolds, flight commander. A pause, then the text, terminated, effective immediately. The firings were swift, public, and deliberate. There were no NDA-shielded exits, no quiet retirements, no internal reshuffling. These weren't employees making mistakes. They were faces of a system that had finally been forced to admit what it had protected for far too long. Skylux sent a second wave of emails minutes later, an internal statement from the CEO himself, confirming that all three individuals had been let go for clear violations of ethics, professional conduct, and equal treatment protocols. And though the tone was corporate, the message was unmistakable. This time, someone paid the price. But to many, especially those who had lived versions of Jasmine's story in silence, the gesture was too little, too late. The media had already seized the moment. Within hours, headlines swept across every major outlet. Skylux crew fired after ethics scandal, video played for entire company, systemic discrimination in the skies, a $50 million mistake. Jasmine Crockett forces Airline's hand in live-fire corporate reckoning. CNN called it the most visible corporate ethics collapse since the Cambridge Analytica breach. Forbes dubbed it the $50 million moral implosion. The phrase caught fire. The $50 million fall. It was repeated across nightly news, podcasts, and global commentary. The public wasn't just watching, they were dissecting. Think pieces emerged. Business schools prepped case studies. HR teams across industries cited the event in memos about reform. But inside Skylux, the temperature was ice cold. Executives avoided eye contact. Senior staff spoke only in whispers. The company that once boasted luxury, prestige, and refinement was now synonymous with betrayal and systemic bias. Well-dressed injustice at 35,000 feet. Meanwhile, the financial bleeding began. On the first day following Jasmine's boardroom intervention, Skylux stock dropped 6%. Day 2, it slipped another 8%. By the end of day 3, the total decline hit 18%, wiping out hundreds of millions in market value. Hedge funds pulled positions. Retail investors fled. Analysts downgraded their projections. A Bloomberg analyst called it an identity crisis in real time, while another noted grimly, "It's not the scandal that's tanking the stock, it's the silence before it, the culture that let it happen, and the fear it might happen again." Behind closed doors, Skylux's investor relations team scrambled to explain how the airline had allowed one of its top shareholders to be publicly humiliated, and how no one had known until it was too late. The answer, of course, was painfully simple. They didn't ask who she was, because they never believed she could be who she is. In the days that followed, Trevor, Jessica, and Captain Reynolds vanished from internal systems. Their badges were revoked, their bios deleted. But in the age of the internet, silence wasn't privacy. Their names trended alongside hashtags like #DoBetter and #bias in uniform. Their faces, frozen mid-denial and screen-captured shame, became memes, cautionary tales, and digital graffiti etched into a culture exhausted by quiet complicity. One post summed it up perfectly. "You don't get to hide behind a uniform when your bias is louder than your service." And yet Jasmine never spoke to the press. Not once. She let the facts speak for themselves. She let the footage do the shouting, and she let the consequences, for the first time in corporate memory, arrive not as a payout, but as a purge. Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about resetting the system. She didn't want retribution. She wanted transparency that couldn't be buried, and accountability that couldn't be spun. She got both, in front of the world. By the end of the week, Skylux had become a case study, not in luxury, but in legacy rot finally exposed under pressure. And as their stock tumbled, their brand fractured, and their former crew disappeared into infamy, one truth rose to the surface like oil in water. They didn't just eject the wrong passenger, they underestimated the wrong woman. And the price was everything. The shock waves didn't end with terminations or stock crashes. They were only the beginning. After the public fallout, the humiliating footage, and the internal bloodletting, Skylux made an announcement no one saw coming. In a move that stunned the entire aviation industry, the airline issued a worldwide directive. Effective immediately, all operations would be suspended for 48 hours. Flights were canceled. Terminals went quiet. Ground crews stood idle on runways from London to Dubai. The world's most exclusive airline, the one that prided itself on flawless luxury and uninterrupted service, had grounded itself for the first time in its decades-long history. The reason? Not a strike, not a technical failure, not even weather. The reason was bias, institutional, systemic, long ignored, and finally, impossible to deny. In a statement delivered by a visibly shaken CEO, Richard Halston, the words felt heavier than anything he had spoken in his career. "We can no longer fly forward while carrying the weight of silence and complicity. Skylux will shut down all global operations for 48 hours while every employee, every single one, undergoes comprehensive ethics and bias reconditioning. That includes me." The press room went still. Not a single camera blinked. And for the first time, perhaps ever, a CEO of a global airline had admitted the unthinkable. This wasn't a personnel issue. It was a cultural rot. A rot that had to be assized not with PR gestures, but with radical self-surgery. Behind the scenes, the engine of change had already begun turning. Equinet, Jasmine Crockett's firm, had been formally engaged to lead the overhaul. But this wasn't some off-the-shelf corporate training program with generic slides and vague awareness goals. No, this was immersive, high-intensity, AI-driven simulation designed to replicate what Jasmine had experienced in real time. Her team of behavioral engineers, coders, and cognitive ethicists had been developing virtual reality modules for years, tools originally designed for law enforcement and hospital networks. Now, for the first time, they would be unleashed inside a corporate aviation giant. The program was called Clear Conscious Leadership, Ethics, Accountability, Rebuild. Within hours, terminals in 10 countries were converted into temporary training centers. VR headsets were flown in by the hundreds. Staff were assigned shifts like boarding schedules, except instead of working flights, they would be walking in someone else's shoes. Literally. The flagship module dropped crew members into a hyper-realistic simulation of a first-class cabin, where they themselves became the marginalized passenger, ignored, dismissed, asked to move despite having credentials, stared at, judged, and ultimately removed. Every micro-expression from simulated attendants, every dismissive glance from passengers, every decision point was recorded, analyzed, and replayed. No one could escape the discomfort, and that was the point. But the most powerful moment wasn't in the headset, it was in the room, because sitting among the attendants, janitors, baggage handlers, and junior staff was the CEO. Richard Halston, stripped of title, tie loosened, headset on, undergoing the exact same training. No private room, no shortcut. He waited in line, answered questions, absorbed the glances. Next to him sat his CFO, 3 rows back, his head of operations. And for once, they weren't at the front of the plane. They were in the back of the system, where real people had been quietly crushed for years. Some employees cried during the training. Others walked out of the room in the stunned silence. A few were furious, rattled not just by the realism, but by the mirror it held up. One security officer, after removing his headset, stared at the floor for 5 full minutes before whispering, "I thought I was fair. I didn't know what it felt like to be invisible." For some, it was the first time they had felt what Jasmine felt that day. For others, it was the first time they'd acknowledged it had ever happened at all. Each session ended not with applause, but with reflection. A digital wall filled with anonymous testimonies where employees could type one sentence about what they had learned. The screen flickered with brutal truths. "I see how I looked at people differently based on their clothes. I ignored complaints like this. I thought they were overreacting. Now I understand why silence can be as violent as action." Over the course of 48 hours, Skylux grounded 2,100 flights, delayed over 350,000 passengers, and lost millions in revenue. But something else happened too. Something more valuable than quarterly profits or investor confidence. They woke up. Not all of them. Not completely. Not perfectly. But the veil had been torn. At the close of the final training day, a live stream session was broadcast company-wide. On screen, Jasmine Crockett. She wasn't there to gloat. She wasn't there to scold. She simply said, "You grounded your fleet. Now ground your assumptions. Start over. That's how we fly forward." She paused, then added, "This is not the end of a scandal. It's the beginning of a culture." Silence followed. And then, one by one, across terminals and offices worldwide, staff began to stand. Some clapped. Some just stood in respect. But they all understood something had shifted forever. Because in 48 hours, Skylux didn't just halt its planes. It confronted its soul. And for the first time in its gilded history, it finally earned the right to call itself an airline for everyone. Following the unprecedented 48-hour grounding of Skylux, after the headlines faded and the market steadied, Jasmine Crockett did something no one expected. In a world obsessed with punishment, she proposed something radical: redemption. The system had failed her, blatantly, publicly, and with devastating consequences. She could have left it burning. She had every reason to. But Jasmine knew the fight wasn't just about exposure. It was about reconstruction. True justice, in her view, didn't end with firings or viral hashtags. It began when people were forced to look inward, confront their bias, and do the hard work of becoming better. That's when she announced the launch of Project Pathway. The idea was simple but revolutionary: a structured, high-accountability re-entry program for individuals terminated due to acts of bias or discriminatory behavior within the service industry. Pathway wasn't soft. It wasn't about forgiveness without effort. It was a battlefield classroom taught by survivors of discrimination, designed by behavioral scientists, and enforced with the same AI technology Equinet had spent years perfecting. The curriculum combined immersive bias simulations, emotional intelligence training, real-time decision modeling, and monitored public service. For every hour in the program, participants would be confronted not with shame, but with truth, unfiltered and relentless. Reintegration, Jasmine said during the launch, only means something if it's earned. Trevor Winslow, former cabin supervisor, once smug, once untouchable, applied 2 months after his termination. His name stirred immediate backlash. Journalists called it a stunt. Commenters called it performative. But Jasmine let him in, not because she believed in him, because she believed in the process. On day 1, Trevor sat at the back of the Pathway intake room, arms folded, jaw locked. He sneered at the facilitators. He scoffed at the modules. He flinched during role-play simulations, where he experienced being denied service, spoken down to, or removed for no reason. But week after week, something shifted. He stopped interrupting. He started listening. In the 4th week, after reviewing a recording of himself from the day he stood over Jasmine with threats masked as procedure, he didn't speak. He just watched over and over, his own voice, his own face. It broke something open. For the first time, he said softly, "I saw her. I actually saw her." Jessica Mayers, the former flight attendant who had taken the cash, also joined the program. She entered with a quiet desperation, not to reclaim her job, but to reclaim her dignity. She cried during her first simulation when a VR passenger thanked her by name, and the system froze the moment to highlight how rare that gesture had been for people who looked like Jasmine. She wrote a journal entry that night. "I sold my values for a tip. I'll never let that happen again." Her journey wasn't linear. Some days she questioned herself. Some days she wanted to walk away. But she didn't. When she completed the program, Pathway didn't return her to the skies, but it offered her a second chance, on the ground. She was quietly reinstated as a ground support coordinator at Skylux, working directly with passengers. She didn't wear wings anymore, but she now carried the weight of them with real awareness. And then there was Captain Dennis Reynolds, once a decorated pilot with 30 years in the cockpit, now a man who had watched his legacy collapse in under 30 minutes of inaction. He didn't join the program for a second chance in aviation. He knew that part of his life was over. He joined because he couldn't live with the idea that silence had become his defining moment. He completed the program in half the time, absorbing every module, every statistic, every testimony. And when he finished, he didn't ask for reinstatement. He asked for purpose. Pathway connected him to a small aviation trade school in Colorado, where he began teaching a course titled The Ethics of Altitude, Integrity and Command. He opened his first class with a photo of Jasmine Crockett. Not as a warning, but as a standard. If you wouldn't speak up for her, he told his students, you don't belong in the sky. Jasmine never made public appearances at the Pathway graduations. She didn't need to. Her presence was in every module, every case study, every moment of confrontation and change. But at the 1-year anniversary, she broke that rule. She stood in a modest auditorium in front of the first 200 graduates of the program, former managers, servers, pilots, and clerks who had all once been part of the problem. She looked out over the crowd and said, "Redemption doesn't begin with an apology. It begins with accountability. You showed up. You didn't run. You stayed when it got uncomfortable. And because of that, you've earned a new kind of uniform, the kind made of humility, not fabric." She paused, then added, "This program wasn't built for comfort. It was built for clarity, and now you have it. Use it." That night, Trevor shook her hand. He didn't ask for a photo. He didn't make a speech. He just said, "Thank you for not slamming the door shut." Jessica handed her a handwritten note. It simply read, "You made me better. I hope I make others better too." Captain Reynolds stood at the back, arms crossed, not out of defiance but respect. And when she looked his way, he nodded once. Nothing more needed to be said. Because this, in the end, wasn't a story about destruction. It was a story about what comes after. Jasmine had walked through fire, and instead of letting it consume others, She turned it into a forge, where broken things could be rebuilt, stronger, wiser, and finally worthy of flight. The transformation of Skylux Airlines had been nothing short of historic. In just under a year, the company went from being the face of corporate prejudice to the first airline in the world to earn the Zero Bias Airline certification, issued by the International Ethics in Aviation Commission, an organization notorious for setting the highest standards in the industry. Until then, no airline had passed the rigorous assessments, which included months of anonymous flight testing, employee interviews, AI-driven data audits, and customer experience simulations across class, race, age, gender, and disability spectrums. But Skylux, under immense pressure and public scrutiny, didn't just meet the standards, it exceeded them. The airline had implemented an internal ethics task force, mandated quarterly behavioral reviews, rewrote its hiring and promotion protocols to eliminate implicit bias, and installed Equinet's AI-backed monitoring tools that flagged microaggressions in customer interactions. These systems didn't just track complaints, they tracked tone, language, and body language using biometric feedback. Employees weren't just trained, they were transformed. The company invested over $50 million into the cultural rehabilitation process. What had once been a brand built on exclusivity had, astonishingly, become a symbol of inclusive excellence. But the true moment of global reflection didn't happen inside a boardroom or on a tarmac. It happened in Singapore, under the lights of the Global Tech and Ethics Forum, where Jasmine Crockett took the stage as keynote speaker. She didn't come dressed in the armor of a CEO. There was no designer logo, no bodyguard in the wings. Just her, elegant in a simple, structured gray suit, hair pinned neatly back, eyes calm but piercing. The auditorium, filled with over 2,000 of the world's most powerful thinkers, investors, and policymakers, fell into total silence as she approached the microphone. She stood still for a moment before she spoke, allowing the weight of her presence to settle over the room. "A year ago," she began, her voice steady, "I was escorted off a first-class flight by security for refusing to give up the seat I had paid for. No slideshow, no visuals, just words, sharp, clear, undeniable. I wasn't loud, I wasn't unruly, I wasn't out of line, I was simply inconvenient. I disrupted the comfort of a system that had grown too used to controlling who belongs where." A hush filled the hall. There was no need to reference the video. It had been watched by millions, dissected in universities, analyzed in corporate ethics seminars. Everyone in that room already knew the story. What they didn't know was what came next. "At first," Jasmine continued, "I thought justice meant reclaiming that seat, holding on to it like proof that I was right, that I belonged. And yes, that mattered. But as the months passed, as the world watched and the system trembled, I realized something deeper." She paused. The room leaned in. "Justice isn't just about sitting in the seat you paid for. Justice is when you use that seat, when you use that position, that privilege, that platform, to make sure others can sit in their seats, regardless of who they are, where they come from, or how the world tries to define them." The statement struck the room like lightning, not because it was loud, but because it was true. In that instant, Jasmine shifted the narrative, from personal victory to systemic responsibility, from a moment of outrage to a blueprint for change. She wasn't speaking as a victim. She was speaking as a leader who had chosen to convert humiliation into transformation, not just for herself, but for an entire industry. She went on to detail how Equinet had partnered with Skylux, not only to rebuild trust, but to design a future where technology didn't just serve passengers, but protected them. AI simulations that identified discriminatory behavior in real time, internal dashboards that tracked ethical KPIs, feedback loops built not around convenience, but accountability. "We didn't just change a policy," she said. "We changed the architecture of the experience." Then came the moment no one would forget. At the close of her talk, Jasmine stepped away from the podium and walked to the edge of the stage. She looked out into the audience, scanning the faces, CEOs, regulators, engineers, senators. Then in a voice that dropped into silence like a verdict, she said, "Power isn't about keeping your seat. Power is what you do with it once you realize others still have to fight for theirs." You don't truly belong until everyone belongs. The applause didn't come immediately. It came slowly, like thunder rolling in after a storm, rising wave after wave until the room stood as one. Not just for her brilliance, not just for her bravery, but for the clarity she brought into the heart of a global conversation. That week, Skylux unveiled its new corporate slogan, no longer about luxury or legacy. It read, "We fly everyone." Short, simple, and finally true. And Jasmine? She didn't just take her seat back. She made it bigger until it had room for everyone. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.